Good afternoon and welcome to the Pension Action Center's Retirement Toolbox webinar. We are pleased to present this event today, which is generously being sponsored by the Boston chapter of the National Forum for Black Public Administrators. My name is Tyler Compton. I'm the staff attorney at the Pension Action Center, and it is my pleasure to host today's panel. The Pension Action Center is a free legal service located on the UMass Boston campus, and we help anyone residing or working in the 6 New England states and the state of Illinois. Our office is dedicated to assisting workers and retirees navigate the often complicated world of retirement and employee benefits. This event is being co-hosted by the William Monroe Trotter Institute for the Study of Black Culture at UMass Boston. We are pleased to be joined today by Professor Michael Johnson of the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, who will be assisting us with the question and answer portion of the event. In addition to his work as professor and researcher, Dr. Johnson currently serves as the president of the Boston chapter of the NFBPA and interim director of the Trotter Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael.
All right, thank you.
Today's panel will focus on public pensions and what public sector employees can do to plan for retirement now. People with public pensions often work for state and local employers and often serve in community-facing roles such as public school teachers, librarians, police and firefighters, and professors. The challenges facing individual workers is as diverse as the work they perform, from being the main caretaker in a multi-generational family to a worker with both private and public sector employment, to someone working and living in the United States who support family members who reside elsewhere. Today's panel will discuss both the policy considerations behind public pensions and what workers can do to protect themselves while planning for retirement. There will be an opportunity for a Q&A discussion at the end of today's webinar, so please make sure to drop any questions you have in the chat box. Also, just as a disclaimer, please be aware that every pension is different and governed by its own rules. This discussion today will focus on broad examples of what workers and retirees should consider, but does not constitute legal advice or financial advice. Please consult a financial advisor or your pension plan representative for personalized advice. This webinar will be recorded and we will post the video to our website, which you can find at umb.edu/pensionaction. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished panelists. So starting off, we have Janelle Espinal. She is a financial educator with a passion for helping young people learn about personal finance. She is the founder of Miss Be Helpful, a YouTube channel focused on teaching money skills to young people. She is also the director of educational outreach for Next Gen Personal Finance, which is a nonprofit working to ensure that every high school student gets a full semester of personal finance education. Ms. Espinal recently published her first book, Mind Your Money, Insightful Stories and Strategies to Help You Reach Your #money goals. Thank you so much for joining us today, Janelle.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited.
Thank you. And next, our other panelist is Jean-Pierre Aubry. He is the Associate Director of State and Local Research at the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College. His work at the CCR includes conducting research and data collection, developing new analytic techniques for evaluating retirement benefits, and securing funding support. Mr. Aubry is recognized as a leading expert on public pensions and also leads the CRR's Pension Consulting Unit, a program which supports states and localities considering pension reform. Thank you so much for joining us, Jean-Pierre.
Really happy to be here. Thanks.
All right, so we'll launch into our discussion. So just starting with Jean-Pierre, I'd like to discuss a little bit more about public pensions in particular. So the first question I have is, with the rising concerns of inflation and cost of living increases, what is the post-COVID landscape for public pensions? And what steps can public pension employers, such as states and local governments, take to reform public pensions?
It's a good question, and we actually took a look at this for our research at the center, and we were surprised to find that public pensions have actually performed pretty well in terms of their finances throughout the COVID period. And part of that is because a lot of the COVID story was a labor story, and in terms of the assets and the returns that pension funds have achieved on their investments, those actually did pretty well. Along with the ARPA funding for state and localities that helped governments put in more towards unfunded liabilities across the states. The result was coming out of the kind of worst parts of the pandemic, pension funds were looking better than they were prior in terms of their funded status, their financial stability. And so in that sense, they came out pretty well. In terms of the inflation, that's a slightly different story, and it depends on, which side of the coin you're looking at, right? So I think when people talk about public pensions generally, they think of them as having COLAs, inflation protection for retirees. That is true. For the most part, pension funds across the US provide some inflation protection for retirees in terms of their benefits increasing over time when they retire. But the key word there is some inflation protection. And what we found when we looked more carefully at these COLA policies is that for the most part, they have limits. So they will provide inflation protection up to 3% a year, right, in terms of increases, or they'll have inflation protection that increases at half of the rate of inflation. So from the pension finances standpoint, this is helpful in the sense that it limits the potential increase in benefit payments during periods of high inflation. So that helps secure the finances of the pension fund. However, from the retiree standpoint, that means that your benefits are potentially losing value in real terms, meaning that relative to all the costs of everything else in the world. And so it is kind of a dual story when it comes to the pandemic and inflation. The finances of pension funds have actually improved, which is a good thing for retirees that want to ensure their benefits that have been promised are secure. At the same time, there have been, from the retiree standpoint, the inflation has really been hasn't been fully offset by the increases in the benefits. That, if for those who aren't totally familiar with the COLA benefits, that may be an unexpected surprise. Hopefully, retirees were aware and were able to make adjustments, but that's a reality as a retiree for state and local government.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the ways that public and private pensions differently. So you get a pension from a private company, there generally is no cost of living added into that at all. And so that's definitely one of the benefits of having a public pension. But you're right, it still can make things very tricky and hard to understand for people.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah. My next question is, what is the best way to approach public pensions for someone with a diverse career track? So someone either working in public pensions now or planning to transition to a public role from the private sector. And specifically, what should these employees know about Social Security?
It's a very good question. And I'm really glad you pointed out the fact about Social Security. So Massachusetts is one of a handful of states where state and local government workers do not contribute to Social Security when they are working in state and local government. And this can have effects in terms of what they receive from Social Security at the end of their career if they go into the private sector. And it's generally a pretty complicated kind of combination between private and public sector work when you don't get Social Security for public sector work. I think, at a high level, the big takeaways that we've found from our research on that topic of kind of workforce going in and out of the public sector labor force, Social Security coverage, is essentially two things. One is that mid-career workers, whether or not you have Social Security coverage or not, don't fare as well as some might presume from public sector pensions. And that is due to the fact that specifically if you work in public sector earlier in your career and then go to the private sector. And the reason for that is that the pension benefit is based on the salary you had when you left state and local work. So if you were a state and local employee, joined teaching at age 20, by 35 or 40, you wanted to go some other route. Or you were in state and local government administration and you were able to find a private sector job doing something similar halfway through your career. You've earned a retirement benefit for your time spent in public sector work. So the formula, 2% times your salary, what have you, that definitely applies. And so you have something coming from pension funds, but it's going to be based on your salary at 35. Which is going to be much lower, hopefully, than what you were earning when you hit retirement at 65 or 70. And so 2% of $35,000 or, 10% of $35,000 is very different than 10% of $80,000 or something when you're retiring. And so understanding that is just important, I think, for state and local workers when they're thinking about the benefits that they get from the retirement system for public sector work. That coming in early and leaving has a significant impact on what you might expect to receive. At the same time, those who come in later, right, it's a different story, right? So the benefit that they receive is likely to be based on the salary at the end of their career. And so therefore, you're really getting what you would expect from retirement benefit is a replacement of your income, a significant replacement of your income near retirement, right, at the end of your working life. And so that's just kind of a very, we think a kind of an overlooked, at least for those who aren't familiar with pension funds, and often like overlooked aspect of public sector pensions, that early career workers who leave are not, don't get as much as you might think from the system. That is even more important in states like Massachusetts, where you don't get Social Security. And so ideally, pension funds are, if they are not providing Social Security coverage, the pension benefit is supposed to be at least as much as Social Security. That's kind of the law. And there's some more detail about exactly what that means, but that's the goal, essentially. And what you find is that in some states that don't provide Social Security coverage, if you leave mid-career, right, because of all the points I just made before, that the benefit that you might get for that time in state and local work may not be as high as the benefit you would have gotten just by being covered by Social Security. So there is a small percentage of workers who kind of get caught in this middle zone, right? If you work a couple of years in state and local work and then go to the private sector, you basically have your whole career covered by Social Security. All good. To some extent, all good. At least you get full Social Security. It's not enough, obviously, to retire. But if you come in to state and local work late in your career, fine, you have a pension that basically covers most of your earnings, so you're pretty good there too. Now, if you do something in the middle, what we found is that you are at an increased risk of your overall retirement. So Social Security that you get for your private sector work, plus the state and local pension you get for your public sector work, all of that together might be less than what you would have gotten by just doing Social Security over the whole period. And that's a pretty significant outcome because Social Security is a low bar, right? It's not designed to give you full retirement income. It's a floor. And so if your whole career of state and local and private sector work combined gives you less than you would get by just getting Social Security, that's a pretty dramatic outcome. And so mid-career workers that start early and then go to the private sector who are not covered by Social Security, they're at increased risk for that kind of outcome. And so just understanding that is kind of something we are slowly starting to unpack and think more about for those types of employees.
That's really helpful advice, especially because when you think of people who are not in the public sector, right? The Social Security was never supposed to be, just as you mentioned, it was never supposed to be the end all. It was always supposed to be Social Security as 1/3 of the building block.
Mm-hmm.
Some type of retirement benefit from your employer and personal savings. That was supposed to be kind of the rollout. But unfortunately, as we see a lot of people, just life happens, things come up, and the personal planning for retirement portion doesn't happen so often. And we see that private pensions are becoming fewer and far between. It's less likely that you will start today as a worker and earn a private pension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's just all the more important to kind of reiterate and think more about the personal savings component as individuals plan for retirement.
Absolutely. Okay, so my final question is, in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge to public pensions right now? And how can employees and retirees plan for these challenges?
Right. I mean, I think some of the biggest challenges are what has always been the challenge for public pensions, which is funding, ensuring state and local governments put aside the money to pay for the benefits that they promised. So I think that's kind of, we live in a political economy. So that's always part of the kind of calculus in terms of thinking about the health of public pensions. I think also what we've just discussed about how public pensions treat short-term, middle-term, and long-term employees. Currently, the model is well designed for long-term employees. Part of that is by design because it's supposed to also be a retention tool. But as the workforce becomes slightly more mobile, it's important for pension funds to think about the share of workers that don't stay full career for whatever reasons, and how this pension system serves them. Historically, the notion was you went to state and local work, you stayed there and until you retired, and these systems are designed around that framework. But going forward, that may not be as just may not capture as large a share of the workforce as it used to. And having pension systems evolve, whether that's including more access to defined contribution plans, which we've seen some pension funds do, or changing the way their formulas work or what salary they're based on. There are many kind of tools in the toolbox for pension funds to think about ways to redistribute essentially the retirement benefit so it's not so backloaded for just long-term workers and treat the other workers a little more equitably.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jean-Pierre. Now I'd like to turn to Janelle and discuss what steps workers and retirees can make to secure their retirement goals. So thanks so much for joining us, Janelle. The first question I have is, you focused your career on helping young people understand personal finance and plan for retirement at the beginning of their careers. So in your opinion, what are the most important tools for planning your retirement?
Well, my favorite tool is going to be a compounding calculator. Compounding interest calculators. As a nerd, I'm on there at least once a month, if not twice a month, just trying out different number combinations. Well, what if I do $200 a week and the market gives an average of 8% and I do this for 30 years? How much would that give me? Okay, what if I do 100 a week, but I do it for 40 years? Or what if I do, $50 a week and I do that for 10 years? And trying lots of different combinations in a compounding calculator can really help you to see worst case scenario, best case scenario, and kind of middle of the road potential outcomes for you. And I think it's really important to look at historical trends from the market to kind of use that to inform what you're typing into a calculator. I cringe a little bit when I hear a lot of people kind of like on podcasts and on YouTube channels saying, oh, the market gives 12, 13%. And it's like, those are averages before inflation adjustments. And so we shouldn't be putting those numbers into a calculator because we're kind of getting an overinflated estimate of what realistically what we'll have in 20, 30 years. So I'd say the best tool is like to pull up a retirement calculator or any compounding interest calculator and just try out different scenarios, because what you'll realize very quickly, and what I realized really quickly, was that when you start earlier, the more time that you have, the less of a burden it is to you per paycheck or per pay period, versus the shorter the time crunch, like, oh, I'm just getting started 10 years before retirement and I want to hit $1 million. I'm gonna have to invest $5,000-$6,000 a month at an average of 8% per year in order to actually get $1 million or more. Versus if I start and I have 30 years to go, I can do $200 a week and still hit that same $1 million with that 8% assumed return. So the more you play with the numbers, the more you realize the urgency to start as early as possible and have as many different diversified options for stashing money away and growing it over time so that you can have a comfortable and dignified retirement.
Yeah. And that's just so important that we everyone at any stage, right, learn to use these tools, but also just not be so scared of them. Like, I think that's a big element, is just being kind of like the burden of having to learn something that seems so technical and hard is just, it can be overwhelming for people. So they just push it off and say, oh, well, I'm not retiring now.
Right. This is a future me problem. This is a tomorrow problem. But again, when you play with these calculators and these tools, you realize it's actually a today problem. And then once you realize that, you get that urgency under you to actually create a financial plan. And honestly, look, there's a lot of tools out there. When you start Googling calculators, you get a bajillion Google results. You don't know what to click. It can be overwhelming. So I'll say, if you haven't played around with the calculator before, my favorite one is on investor.gov. You just scroll all the way down and click on the investing calculator. and the compounding calculator, and that gives you options to put in the return rate per year, a monthly contribution, a starting amount, and you can kind of play around with that to see what all the different scenarios could look like.
Oh, fantastic. That's a great tip, Janelle. So I know that your work primarily focuses on smart money tips for young people, but what are some helpful ways to plan for retirement at any point in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I would think at any point, it's really important to focus on your financial literacy, your actual knowledge of what are all the different options that you have. Because I think that that's the biggest thing I notice when I'm talking to folks of all ages and any ages. They'll reach out to me and say, what's the difference between a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA? And, that's something that you should know. I mean, if you're trying to plan for retirement and have a dignified retirement, you got to know and understand the differences between these types of accounts, because that's how you're going to be able to make the most informed decision that works for you really at any age. And whenever you kind of see advice online that's like everybody should have a Roth IRA, that to me, again, sort of makes me cringe, because you don't know what is going to be the best individualized advice for you based on some general recommendation on a website. The only way to know is to look at your specific goals, your specific income, your specific timeline and risk tolerance. If you're really not comfortable with taking on a high level of risk, then maybe, the types of accounts or investments that you choose would look very different from, an average recommendation for someone who is of average retirement age as their goal and with an average risk tolerance, because you don't fit that profile. So I think it's really, really, really important to be as informed as possible, kind of see it as like you're going to sit down to play Monopoly. Like, you cannot start playing if you don't know all the rules. You kind of have to know the rules. And the people who end up losing when they sit down to play Monopoly are the people who go, don't explain the rules. I'll just learn as I play. Let's just start playing, and then I'll figure it out as we go. And okay, good luck. You're going to be the one to lose, because you really don't know how to plan strategically in advance, since you don't understand all the rules and what might come. So I really think you have to kind of see it as creating a game plan, and it requires you to understand all the nuances, all the vocabulary terms, the different types of accounts, and all the different investments with their different risk profiles, because then and only then can you say, all right, I think this is going to be best for me based on what I understand about it and based on what I can do financially, and what my goals are. So, I mean, financial literacy, I would say, is number one. And then number two, I would say for any age and anybody at any point in their career is diversification. It's just the name of the game. You don't know what's going to do best. You don't know if real estate's going to have a better return than the stock market in the long run. You don't know which asset classes are going to have the highest return. And trying to predict that is pointless, and one of the best resources I will share to really illustrate this concept of like, it's useless to try to predict what's going to be the best for you is the Callan periodic table of investment returns. I recently found that a couple of years ago, and I'm obsessed. It sort of plays off of the idea of, the periodic table of elements in chemistry, but instead it categorizes all the different asset classes that you could invest in. So the S&P 500, the real estate market in the US, international stocks, bonds, long-term bonds, and it will let you know which ones have been the highest performing every year for the past 20 years. And what you'll notice, a key takeaway as you look at it, is that it's unpredictable. There's just no pattern. There's no clear pattern that you can observe. The volatility for all of them is clear. And while some of them are less volatile than others, some will have been in the number one position and then gone all the way down to the losing investment return from one year to the next. And so this is why you can't really pick favorites when it comes to investing. You've got to be, get the emotion out of it and just say, I want a well-diversified portfolio of assets and investments, because who knows? No one's got a crystal ball. No one's going to know the future. So I'd say financial literacy is number one, and your, diversified investment portfolio is going to be number two.
Oh, absolutely. And again, once you kind of have those tools and you learn a little bit more and you have the confidence to speak the language, right? Then
Yes.
Going in and monitoring your investments, that's something that everyone can do. And that's something you definitely teach people how to do.
Absolutely. And so important. So important.
Absolutely. So my final question, Janelle, what aspects of financial literacy have been the most beneficial to you personally? And what types of things resonate with the communities that you work with? So the high school students versus college students versus the recent college graduates.
So I'll say for me personally, understanding the difference between saving versus investing was probably the most critical part of me changing my future trajectory financially and helping my family. My family, you know, I come from an immigrant family, and in a lot of immigrant families, you're kind of taught, you know, save, 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 save. And that's, with as well intentioned as that advice may be, it is really misguided, because what it's going to do is end up not allowing you to really keep up with the inflation rate that's, especially right now. I mean, inflation is probably a little bit under 4% right now, but in recent years has been the highest it's been in the past 40, 50 years. So it's scary. You know, the inflation word right now is, there's a lot of people that are very sensitive to it with good reason. And so when you're saving, the savings rates that you get at your bank, at your credit union, at your community bank, at your, you know, fintech app, they're not going to compete with the rates of growth that you would get investing in, you know, a slightly higher risk profile investment rather than a savings account. And so I, you know, I was always kind of, you know, saving early on and thinking about, you know, when I finish paying off my debt, I want to save more. And a lot of people talk about increasing your savings rate. And even this conversation that we're having today, we're talking about retirement, right? People say saving for retirement or retirement savings. And again, cringe. We cannot save our way to retirement. So we need to fundamentally shift the language that we're using to describe retirement, investing for retirement. You can't save for retirement. You have to invest for retirement. And once that shift kind of happened for me, and I, you know, understood the numbers by using all these tools and just saying, saving is never going to get me a dignified, comfortable retirement. And I'm just going to keep repeating cycles of poverty if I don't get serious about understanding the world of investing. And I know that as a teacher, or as a, you know, fireman or a police officer, or, you know, other types of public employee in career fields, it can be tough, because you're putting so much of your time and so many hours to work, that now it's like, and then when I get home and I'm exhausted, now I have to learn about investing. But, you know, the answer is yes, because no one else is going to teach you about it. You've got to teach yourself. I wish we had a system right now where employers were responsible for educating their employees about retirement. I wish there were, you know, mandates that required everyone to learn about financial literacy, so that we wouldn't have to feel like we don't know a lot of this information. But that's just not the world we live in, at least not yet. That's changing. You know, schools are starting to require financial literacy, and a lot of employer resource groups or employee resource groups are starting to educate folks. But ultimately, it means that you sort of have to take it upon yourself to understand the difference between a Roth and a traditional, to understand, you know, what is the traditional historical return of the market, and after inflation adjustments, you know, what is the difference between a stock fund and a bond fund, and what is the difference between an ETF, an exchange traded fund, and an index fund or a mutual fund. Because if you can't answer these questions, you're going to be afraid to make choices because you're lacking information. So the more empowered you are with knowledge and information about these things, the more likely you are to feel confident making your own financial plan. And ultimately, if you don't have the time or the resources or the energy, or, you know, you really are not going to be able to wrap your mind around these concepts, then talk to a fee-only fiduciary advisor. That's the only type of financial advisor I personally would ever work with. Fee-only fiduciary advisor to sit with you and talk to you about a plan that can help you feel confident.
That's really, really helpful. Thanks so much, Janelle. I see that Michael has some follow-up questions. I'll just turn it right over to Michael.
Hi, Janelle and
Michael.
here. Thanks so much for everything that you shared. I just had a few clarifying questions. I know we have some others that are coming down the road. But Janelle, can you use the word risk tolerance? Can you remind us what that means and how we incorporate that into our retirement calculations?
Absolutely. So the most basic way that I understand risk tolerance is, how comfortable are you putting money into stocks versus bonds versus keeping it in cash? And the difference between the three, and why you might not be comfortable with one versus the other, is how likely you are to lose some or all of that money. So if you put your money in the bank, generally speaking, you're going to be able to go there tomorrow and the money will be there. Now, of course, it might have less purchasing power because inflation is increasing, but the dollar amount that you see in your bank account will not decrease unless you spend it. So that gives a certain amount of security and, you know, confidence for folks to feel like, oh, good, okay, my money's protected. I know it's going to be there, especially with FDIC insurance protection or NCUA protection on your money. Now, with investing into the stock market or the bond market, you're now taking on a level of risk that doesn't exist with a bank account. So if you can't stomach this level of risk, your risk tolerance is going to be very low, because you are not tolerant to risking that when you check your account balance tomorrow, it could potentially be less than what it was today, even though you didn't withdraw a penny. So that concept, if you can't stomach the idea of logging into your account and seeing a lower balance tomorrow than you had today, even though you've been consistently adding money, then your risk tolerance is going to be a bit lower than average. I would say the more you research the history of the stock market and history of bond market, the more you're going to come to understand that this is normal. It is a normal cycle of the stock market for your account balance to go down and up and down and up, sort of like a roller coaster ride. And when you pull up any chart of the stock market, you'll see that exact same visual. And that just means that you have to get more comfortable with that idea to be at least a bit risk tolerant, so that you can have the potential to grow your money over the long run, much more than you would if you just park it at a bank or credit union.
Thanks. So I have a follow-up fact question for both of you, Jean-Pierre and Yaneli. For those of us who haven't been following the news closely, can you tell us how the stock market has been doing lately and what that means for our investment choices?
Sure. Jean-Pierre, do you want to do that, or do you want me to talk about that?
I can start. I mean, it's been kind of a rocky road because of COVID and then kind of the Fed, and it's been a lot of kind of macroeconomic, is the term people use in my field, impacts, right, that have been pushing stuff around in weird ways. But overall, speaking to Johnny's point about risk tolerance, it's been a bumpy ride over the past 5 years, we'll say, or 4 years, excuse me, since 2020. But overall, it's up. And that's kind of the point, right? And I kind of wanted to piggyback off what John Lee was saying about, do you want to check your account every day and risk tolerance? And I think there's something important about investing for retirement, is that it hopefully is a long-term investment you're making, right? You're putting money away now that you don't need now, right? So you're trying to find out what amount of money that you don't need over the next 5 years or the next 10 years. Like what amount of money would you be comfortable putting away and say, I don't need this. I won't need to pull it out for some emergency. So handling all the savings you need for short term is one thing. And then anything beyond that, that's when you put those in retirement accounts. And that's the kind of stuff ideally you don't look at every day, right? Because that gives you heartburn. And so the notion is is that you don't look at it every day, because you don't need it. If it goes down, I don't need it, right? No big deal. It will go up later. If it's something that you need, then you shouldn't be putting it in a place where it might lose value, right? And so that's kind of an important distinction between retirement savings and other types of savings. And it kind of, I think, that's where that, when you think about risk tolerance, it's really like, is there some portion of your savings that you don't need today, where if it goes down, it doesn't affect you on your day-to-day finances? And hopefully we all can find a little amount that works in that way that we can put aside.
Thanks. And I wanted to follow up another fact question for Yaneli before I turn it back to Tyler. You used the term fee-only fiduciary advisor. Can you remind us what that is?
Yes, it's my favorite type of advisor. So when I first started working in financial education, a lot of people would say, anytime you learn about these types of, webinars, or you're reading information online, this isn't individualized investment advice, and you should speak to a financial advisor. And when I hear that, cringe a little, because that's just a general, financial advisor is a very general term. And the way that a financial advisor makes their money varies depending on the type of advising that they do. And so the term fiduciary was the first time that I was introduced to this concept, that some financial advisors sort of take on this like oath to ensure that the education, information, the advice that they're giving you is specifically with the intention of matching your specific goals and is for your best interest. And then that means that it opens a can of worms, because now there's all these other advisors who don't do that. So what type of advice do they give you? And they may be giving you advice that they think is going to help you financially, but ultimately it's still tainted or biased, because they may be receiving some type of compensation, commission, or kickback by putting you into specific investments that they're being nudged to, put investors into through their relationship with these particular funds. So as you start to think about, well, who do I want to get advice from? Somebody who is genuinely giving me the advice that they've researched and believe is best for me based on my goals, using their expertise, or somebody who may actually be, influenced a little bit by the potential for them to receive an extra bonus, an extra commission, a free vacation, or something that they maybe wouldn't get unless they push me to a specific investment that maybe they wouldn't recommend it otherwise if they didn't have that incentive. So, just as a quick analogy, I always think about when I go shopping for shoes, if I walk into the store and the, sales clerk approaches me and says, hey, can I help you find a pair of shoes? I say, yes, I'm wearing, a purple dress to this wedding and I'm looking for a pair of shoes. If they go and say like, oh, you should buy this, bright yellow pair of shoes with, brown and red lines on it. And I'm like, that doesn't really sound like it goes with a purple dress. Like, what kind of advice is this, right? They may be incentivized to sell that pair of shoes for a commission.
Mhm.
So they might not be pointing me to the purple shoe aisle because they don't get commissions on those shoes, even though that's clearly the best match for my dress.
Mhm.
So I always try to think about what is the ulterior motive that somebody might have to give you advice. So that's fiduciary. It's someone who's going to give you advice based on your goals and what's best for you. And the fee only part just means that they're not taking a percentage of your money or your account balance, but instead they only make money by charging you a fee only. So that might be $500 for a 1-hour consultation with them. And, and that's it. After that hour, you pay them the $500, you know exactly what you pay, versus them saying, well, we have a 1.2% of all assets under management. So as we work with you, the more money you make and grow and build, the more dollars they can take, obviously as a percentage of your assets. In the case of a fee-only fiduciary, it's just a flat dollar amount for the same quality service.
Great, thanks. Tyler, back to you.
Absolutely. So continuing these kind of questions for both of you. So last year, PAC hosted a webinar discussion on the racial wealth gap and its effect on retirement for households of color. So what are some ways for all retirees to bridge this gap? Janelle, maybe that's your question. And what are some ways that public sector employers specifically can bridge this gap? And John Pierre, could you kind of discuss that part?
Yep. You can go first this time, Johnny.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I would say in my own family, the way that I've done this is really focusing on education. It's so hard for me to sit down and talk to people in my family about, what we should be doing with money when they don't fundamentally understand the differences between some of these terms and, vocabulary. So I will constantly send in my family chat videos, articles, news. Hey, take a look at I-bonds right now. They're pretty high. If you have money that you don't want to risk in the market, this is a good opportunity, to put $10,000. And then I'll have my sister respond like, oh, tell me more about this I-bond thing, and that's something that I'm very intentionally doing to empower and educate my family, because I recognize that, as children of immigrants and my parents being non-English speaking Americans, new Americans, they're the kind of the least likely profile in America to have gotten financial literacy education. And so we sort of have to overcompensate by self-empowering and self-educating. So I definitely, again, kind of like not to keep, beating a dead horse, but I would keep saying that financial literacy is critical, and empowering yourself with knowledge, reading books, articles, listening to podcasts. There's so many out there, but they won't come to your phone because this isn't the type of stuff that goes viral. So you got to go looking for it, hunting for it, searching out these key terms. Otherwise, you won't come across it. And then the second thing that I would say is really the taboo of money in communities of color must be broken. And it's so difficult because every, ethnic community or a community of color in our groups sort of tend to have these different nuanced and complicated relationships with finances and financial institutions. I know in Latin America, there's so much corruption in the financial space that many Latin Americans who come to the US have this really contentious relationship because they have a mistrust of financial institutions, of bankers, of, advisors. And so they automatically put up a wall and they're guarded. And so we have to sort of start talking more openly about this. And for me, at least, that started with having, Zoom calls throughout COVID. I started to plan Zoom calls with my siblings and say, hey, all, like, mom and dad are going to start getting close to retiring soon in a couple of years. What are we doing? Do we have a plan for them? what makes sense for us. And so we decided to come together and create a pool of money. I opened a high yield savings account online, added another one of my siblings and myself to the account, and all of the siblings every month will send via Zelle or Venmo, whatever works for them, the funds into the account. And we've been doing that for years, so that when my dad was actually finally ready to stop working, Social Security benefits that he collected were so low because of the type of work he got as an immigrant worker, that we were able to supplement that by offering to pay for whatever he couldn't cover for the month, and health stuff, travel, groceries he couldn't cover. And that is such a phenomenal thing, but I wouldn't have been able to do that alone. I had to open the conversation up, really tackle that taboo of money and actually create a plan that was community based, so that all the stress and financial burden wasn't on just me, but on all of their children. And fortunately for me, or for my parents, they have 9 children. So I have 8 brothers and sisters. So there was a lot of people to help create this community-based plan, but that's something I would recommend.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Jean-Pierre, you had your follow-up?
Yeah. So, in terms of public sector workers, people of color, have some advantages from those that don't work in the public sector. So, for one, public sector is one of the greatest employers of people of color, right, relative to other arenas. So, at a kind of macro level, it's providing pensions, right, to people of color more so than and retirement benefits generally more so than any other sector in the United States. So, just at a high level, public sector is good. Work is good for that reason in terms of closing the wealth gap. And yet, still at an individual level, I think whenever there are kind of options in the retirement system or kind of hurdles to navigate, all the things Yanli just mentioned, like in terms of providing access to accounts, but not really helping people get onto accounts, just providing access, right? There's racial disparities immediately, right? We see it in the private sector when you have optional 401k plans, like who enrolls, who doesn't, right?
Yes.
Who contributes fully to the match, who doesn't, right? So all those options are opportunities for racial disparities. And so in the public sector, oftentimes the pension is sold as you have a pension, you don't have to worry about anything else, right? And there are some people who listen to that, and there are other groups who maybe take an extra step to also take advantage of all the optional savings that are available, DC plans, right? And so I think for workers of color in the public sector, it's similar to every other space. It's kind of being a little more proactive. The beautiful part is that they have a large employer that has that is a little bit more not patriarchal, but it's kind of looking out for the benefit of employees, because they have a retirement system already. They have other types of retirement benefits, and they have infrastructure, right? They have HR offices, big, right? They have and they can point you in the right direction. And so you have a large employer that you can turn to that hopefully can give you some basic guidance and avail you of the other savings opportunities that the employer provides. So I think, for public sector workers, they have some advantages from in terms of people of color relative to those who are not in the public sector, because they already work for a big employer who provides retirement benefits and who has infrastructure around helping individuals access retirement.
So I see we have a lot of Q&A questions, so I want to be mindful of time and turn it over to Michael, who will present some of the questions from the audience.
Great, thanks. So we do have a lot. We'll see what we can get into. But the first one asks, actually, I'll go to the second one. When you leave a public sector job, how much does your pension move into Social Security? And I think there's a larger issue, which is how can people consider public sector versus private sector employment in making that trade-off between base salary and the security of a pension?
Right.
So either one of you.
I can start. So if I understand the question correctly, my answer would be that none of your pension moves into Social Security, I think is my answer, is that your pension is totally separate and outside the Social Security system. It's taken into account in a very complicated way that I don't think is right for this forum, I guess, to delve into, where to some extent they look at your pension benefit in retirement and they will offset your Social Security benefit somewhat to adjust for that. The reason they do the offset, though, which I will talk about, and it's called the windfall elimination provision that I'm sure Massachusetts employees near retirement are very familiar with, because it sometimes comes as a surprise. And I think Social Security is working to rectify that and put out more information so that individuals understand that before reaching retirement. So because workers in places like Massachusetts don't contribute to Social Security, they look like individuals who have no income to Social Security. They look really poor. And so Social Security is a progressive system, meaning that they try to give more money to poor people than those that are wealthy in retirement. And so state and local workers who don't put in Social Security look really poor, and they get a kind of outsized benefit because they actually are working. They actually have an income, and they actually have a retirement benefit. And so the WEP tries to make adjustments for that, saying, oh, you know, what we calculated was way too much because we thought you had almost no income your whole career. But it turns out you actually were working a reasonable job and have a reasonable pension. So we're trying to kind of reduce your Social Security in order to adjust for that. Exactly how the reduction works is pretty complicated, but it's just important to know that there will be a reduction. And the reason for that is essentially because A, you didn't put into Social Security, and B, that Social Security kind of would provide too much because of that, in terms of what its benefit would be, given its design, which is meant to give more in terms of retirement security to those who don't have than those who do.
Right. Yep, I completely agree. I think the only thing I would add is this is really going to be dependent on the details of your plan too. And I think a lot of people, they have an administrator for their pension plan and they don't reach out to them. Consult with the administrator of your pension plan, as well as the Social Security Administration. If you all have not visited ssa.gov, I mean, a treasure trove of resources, all free. You can create an account to see, you know, what would be accessible, available to you. I did this with my parents. They created the SSA.gov accounts, and then they were able to use the retirement planning tools to see exactly what they would qualify for if they used the age of 62 versus 65 versus 70. And, you know, those tools are so hugely helpful. Oftentimes we just don't reach out to the administrators of our plans or go onto these websites to use these tools, but reach out and ask these questions and you will get the answers that you're seeking.
Again, it's great. I mean, public sector workers, and they work for these big, large employers that have robust administration and benefit assistance kind of around the retirement issue, whether it's saving in 401ks or putting in an actual pension. And so taking advantage of those is really important if you work for a public sector employer.
Definitely.
Thanks. I wanted to just put a note in here that we have probably more questions in the Q&A than we can get to, and a couple that I've put in the chat. So perhaps after the webinar, we can make sure to compile all the questions and maybe think of an FAQ or something to share with people. So I'd like to skip to a question that is farther down in the list, but it seems pretty important. It says, what advice do you have for people who have a break in employment due to caregiving responsibilities?
I think this is more Yanali.
Yeah, this is a tricky one, but I would say, I would say that this is something that you sort of have to strategically plan for. And you know, what I think about when I think about this question is, what's your financial plan for the long term? And now you sort of have to accommodate for this period of time, this gap in that plan. Without a long-term financial plan in place, it's extremely difficult. It's increasingly difficult to sit down and actually make a plan for a break because you don't have a longer plan that you need to break from. So I would say it starts with long-term financial planning and really thinking about what is your budget this year? What will your budget look like next year, in 5 years, in 10 years? And what's your vision for that? It might not be an exact science, exact numbers, but just having that plan in place is then going to allow you to say, okay, how can I finagle these numbers? How can I, adjust this so that I can take these next 2 years to care for my parents? and or my my aunts and uncles or whoever might need your care. So I would say start with a long-term financial plan and then decide where you need to adjust. Does it mean that you need to sacrifice a little bit more upfront, or sacrifice a little bit more on the tail end? So a quick example, I am a big fan of the Roth IRA for myself, and I always tell younger investors, like, don't discount the Roth IRA. It's got really great benefits for tax-free earnings and withdrawals in retirement. However, you don't get an immediate tax break now, which means that you're not really freeing up the money when you file your taxes in the immediate term. So if you're going to shift, then you might actually choose to opt for the traditional IRA instead of the Roth IRA for a year or two, so that when you do go file your taxes, you potentially can increase your tax refund and have some extra money, or reduce your tax liability. So that could really change your financial picture in the short term, in the next year or two, versus continuing to do what you've been doing. And again, not really having a longer plan to actually look at where you want to make adjustments. So I would say you start with the long-term financial plan and then figure out where you need to break away from that. And don't be afraid to meet with a fee-only financial advisor about these things, because, I find that a lot of times people will say, oh, well, I don't want to pay extra for that. But the confidence that you get and the plan that you can walk away with, I would venture to say a lot of people are willing to say that that's priceless, because you sleep at night much more peacefully when you have a clarity and confidence in a plan. So I would say, definitely opt for those two things: a long-term financial plan and potentially talking to a fee-only financial advisor to plan for that break.
Thank you. So I want to follow up with the question I had earlier about the fee-only fiduciary advisor and the need for a long-term financial plan. So for those of us who are not maybe very well banked or not plugged in, this is not the place to recommend particular providers, but can you give people a sense of generally where they should go? For example, for those of us in a union, should we call up someone in our union?
That's a good point. So I would say, just to start off with, if you have a 403B from your employer and you're participating, or even if you're not, there's an administrator who is responsible for the administration and management of that 403B plan. Go ahead and look at that paperwork and find out who's that plan administrator and call the number. These folks are paid by your employer through that partnership to be of service and to be a resource to you. So you don't have to come out of pocket to talk to someone who is part of the plan administrator for your 403B. Same goes for 457B if you have access to that. And if you're already a paying customer with a brokerage that allows you to fund a Roth IRA or a traditional IRA, same thing. Call them up. You are a customer, so now they're going to really prioritize having someone on the phone answer your questions. These are the types of folks that you really want to get information from, because they're the ones that directly oversee your funds, not general retirement money, your specific money that you're putting into your retirement accounts.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, again, I would say that, I mean, the HR departments of all your employers should have this number on speed dial. So you should be able to ask them for, the administrator of your 403B or your 457 or your 401k, whatever you have. They should have that number on speed dial. Should not, if you go to your HR, to get someone to speak to. So that would also, I would agree, that would be my about. I also wanted to kind of go back to one last thing, if we have a moment, on that Yanli was talking about before with the paid caregiving responsibility. So we are talking to mostly Massachusetts residents, right? In public. Okay. So again, another reason we are lucky to live in the state of Massachusetts, that we have a paid family leave at the state level, which is really nice. I know, because I took advantage of it when my wife and we had our first child, right? So and it's a wonderful program. It's new, and it's something that all employers should, again, HR departments, if you work for a state and local employer, they should know all about this and be able to help you take advantage of the benefits of the paid family leave in Massachusetts. And additionally, to Yanli's point, there are some caregiving responsibilities that are somewhat predictable and some that are not, right? And so potentially having to care for your older parents is somewhat predictable. And so I think, to the extent that you can plan for some of these elements that are, I think, part of the natural course of life, do so as early as you can. Obviously, things come up that you cannot anticipate. The paid family leave program is great for helping with things like that. And we're lucky to have that program available in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I love that point, Jean-Pierre. I'll add one thing. I wish I knew about long-term care insurance when I was in my 20s, because investing in long-term care insurance, it gives you options for both yourself and your aging parents. It's a type of insurance that just helps cover costs of things that you'll need to pay, like nursing homes, assisted living facilities, maybe even in-home care, and all these kinds of needs that will come up in the future. I never knew about it. So if you know already that caring for your parents rather than your parents helping care for you is something that you're dealing with, then, thinking about long-term care insurance is something that you could talk to with your fee-only fiduciary advisor, or just do some research on your own about that type of insurance and if it makes sense for your financial plan.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much, Janelle and Jean-Pierre and Michael. This has been a fantastic discussion. Every time we have a webinar, I wish that we had planned for 5 hours so that we could just keep going. But unfortunately, we'll have to end for today. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So to the audience, thank you so much for attending the Retirement Toolbox webinar. I want to again thank our panelists, Janelle Espinal and Jean-Pierre Aubry, for their time and insight. I would also like to thank the Boston chapter of the National Forum for Black Public Administrators for sponsoring today's event. I would like to thank Dr. Michael Johnson and the Trotter Institute for co-hosting. A recorded version of this webinar will be posted to our website shortly at umb.edu/pension-action, and we're going to try to get that out to registrants of the program as well. So again, thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.